There is a wall in Egypt that has survived for more than 3,000 years. It stands at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile, built by Ramses III to commemorate the moment his empire nearly ceased to exist. The carvings are enormous, chaotic. You see warships locked in combat, soldiers falling into the water, archers drawing at close range. But look more carefully, and the image becomes stranger, because this is not just a military scene. There are ox carts in the carvings, women, children, pots, and furniture loaded onto wagons. Whatever this force was, it was not simply an army on a raid. These were people in motion, an entire population moving, pushing south and east toward Egypt with everything they owned. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, and in the year 1207 BCE, give or take, they helped trigger one of the most catastrophic collapses in human history. Within a few decades of their appearance in the records, the Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece went dark. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed entirely. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, was burned and never rebuilt. The Bronze Age network of interconnected civilizations, trade routes, palace economies, diplomatic correspondence, fell apart so completely that historians still argue about exactly what happened. The Sea Peoples appear in the wreckage of that world as both symptom and cause, destroyers and refugees simultaneously, their identity carved in enemy stone, and almost nowhere else. For 200 years, scholars have argued about who they were, and a theory emerged that felt, for a long time, almost convincing. Then, ancient DNA was extracted from a burial site tied directly to one of those Sea Peoples groups. The genome results came back, and what they showed did not match the theory, not even close. What the DNA pointed toward instead raised a question that nobody had fully prepared for. Here is the old model, and it was not a bad model. It was built carefully from real evidence, just not the right kind. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian texts under several names: the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Sherdan. Ramesses III listed them as a coalition. They came from the sea and from the north, his inscriptions say, and no land could stand before them. Scholars looked at those names and started noticing similarities. Peliset, Philistines. Tijeker, possibly Tuxer, a name connected to the Trojan region. Sherdan, could that be Sardinia? Shekelesh, Sicily. The name matching was never conclusive, but it pointed in one consistent direction: the northern and eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean world. That interpretation gained further support from the material evidence. Philistine pottery, found in abundance at sites in the southern Levant, looked startlingly similar to Mycenaean and Aegean pottery styles. The burial practices at early Philistine sites were different from Canaanite burial practices. Philistines in the early period apparently consumed pork at rates unusual for the region. Their architectural style had foreign elements. Everything visible in the ground said, these people arrived from somewhere else, and that somewhere else looked Aegean. The migration hypothesis built itself around the Bronze Age collapse. It went roughly like this. Around 1200 BCE, drought, famine, internal rebellions, and the disruption of trade routes caused the Mycenaean palace civilization to collapse. Populations were displaced. People took to ships. They swept east and south, raiding, relocating, and eventually settling. The Philistines planted themselves along the southern coast of Canaan. The broader coalition of Sea Peoples that the Egyptians described was, in this reading, primarily a population movement originating in the Aegean world, set in motion by the collapse of the Bronze Age system. It was a coherent story. It fit the ceramic evidence. It fit the timing. It fit the geographic logic of people fleeing westward collapse by moving toward Egypt and the Levant. But the story rested almost entirely on objects. And here is the thing about objects. Pottery styles spread through trade, imitation, and cultural contact. A Mycenaean ceramic tradition appearing in Canaan could mean migrants arrived, or it could mean local potters adopted a fashionable style. Helmet iconography on a temple wall tells you what Ramesses III's artists carved, not necessarily where those helmeted people were born. Place name similarities are suggestive at best and circular at worst. Objects can travel without people. Pottery does not have ancestry. For over 150 years, the Sea People's question was treated as a historical and archaeological puzzle. Texts and artifacts. Texts and artifacts. The bones that had been excavated at Philistine sites, and there were bones, human remains going back decades of careful excavation, had not been genetically analyzed in any meaningful way. Not because the question wasn't worth asking, but because the science to answer it didn't yet exist, and because, perhaps, the archaeology already seemed to have told the story. Why look deeper when the pottery already pointed to the Aegean? The bones existed. The question just hadn't been asked with enough urgency. The site of Ashkelon, on the southern coast of what is now Israel, has been excavated by the Leon Levy expedition since the 1980s. It is one of the most important Philistine sites in the world. And over decades of work, the excavation recovered something rare in the Levant. Intact human burials from stratified contexts, including from the early Philistine occupation layer, roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE, Iron Age 1, the period immediately following the Sea People's arrival. The problem with ancient DNA from this region is that the Levant is one of the worst places on Earth to preserve genetic material. Heat degrades DNA rapidly. Humidity accelerates bacterial activity. The organic molecules that carry ancestry information break apart into fragments too small and too contaminated to sequence reliably. Earlier attempts to extract ancient DNA from the southern Levant had largely failed or returned results too degraded to trust. What changed was the method and the timing. By the mid-2010, ancient DNA extraction techniques had advanced to the point where researchers could work with extraordinarily degraded samples. The key was targeting the petrous bone, the densest part of the skull, sitting behind the ear canal, along with tooth cementum, which preserves DNA better than almost any other tissue. Specialized protocols could now isolate authentic ancient fragments from the noise of bacterial contamination and, crucially, from the DNA of every modern person who had ever handled the sample. Cleanroom facilities, rigorous authentication, statistical tests to confirm that what was being sequenced was genuinely ancient. And there was one more prerequisite. To read what the genome actually said about ancestry, you needed a reference library, a map of ancient populations across the regions in question. Without Bronze Age Aegean genomes to compare against, without ancient Anatolian populations, without Canaanite baseline samples, the signal in the DNA would have nowhere to land. That reference library had been assembled slowly through years of parallel ancient DNA research across Eurasia. By 2019, it finally existed at a resolution that made comparison meaningful. The study was published in the journal Nature that year. The lead author was Harney. The senior lab was David Reiche's paleogenomics group at Harvard, working in collaboration with the Leon Levy expedition. The team had successfully sequenced DNA from 10 individuals buried at Ashkelon across 3 time periods. 3 from the Bronze Age, before the Philistines arrived, 4 from the early Philistine period, Iron Age 1, and 3 from later in the Iron Age, after the Philistine culture was already centuries established. The early Philistine individuals, the ones buried at Ashkelon right at the beginning of the Philistine presence, showed something the Bronze Age Canaanite individuals from the same site did not. A substantial European-related ancestry component, not a trace, not statistical noise. A measurable, significant genetic contribution from European-related populations, clearly distinguishable from the local Canaanite genetic baseline. That should have confirmed the Aegean theory exactly. European ancestry appearing at a Philistine site in the early Iron Age, that's the migration. That's the Mycenaean connection. Case solved. But the researchers looked more carefully at where in Europe the ancestry signal was actually pointing, and that is where the story turns. The European ancestry in those early Philistine individuals did not cluster with Mycenaean Bronze Age Greeks. The comparison populations pulled from ancient Aegean genomes, people who had actually lived in Bronze Age Greece, whose DNA had been sequenced from sites in the Aegean world, did not match the Ashkelon Iron Age wine individuals closely enough to confirm a direct connection. The signal pointed further west, toward southern Europe, toward the central or western Mediterranean. possibly populations related to Bronze Age Sardinia, or Sicily, or the Iberian Peninsula. The genetic affinity was real, it was statistically distinguishable, but it was not Aegean in the specific sense that the textbook theory required. Say that plainly. The DNA said Europe, but not the Europe anyone had been pointing at for 150 years. This is a peer-reviewed study from one of the most respected paleogenomics laboratories in the world. The result was not generated by a fringe team with an agenda. The methodology is the same methodology that has successfully traced migration patterns from the Pontic steppe into Bronze Age Europe, from East Asian populations into the Americas, from North Africa into Iberia. When this lab reports a statistically significant ancestry signal, it is not noise. And here is what makes the result hard to dismiss even further. By the time the researchers looked at the later Iron Age individuals at Ashkelon, people buried centuries after the initial Philistine settlement, the European ancestry signal had almost entirely disappeared. It had diluted into the local Canaanite genetic pool within 2 or 3 generations. These were not the descendants of a continuously arriving migration wave. These were real people who had arrived with their own ancestry, who had then integrated into the local population so thoroughly that their genetic signature faded from the record within a few hundred years. That pattern is the fingerprint of an actual migration event, a real founding population arriving, settling, and then being absorbed. The signal is consistent with the Philistines being a biologically distinct founding group. What is inconsistent with the old model is where that group came from. Walk through what this rules out. The simple narrative of Mycenaean Greeks displaced by the Bronze Age collapse, sailing to Canaan and becoming the Philistines, is no longer tenable as a clean direct migration story. The Bronze Age Aegean reference genomes exist. They have been compared. They do not match closely enough. If the Philistines were primarily Mycenaean Greek refugees, the DNA should show it. It does not. This matters beyond the Philistines specifically. The Philistines are the single Sea Peoples group with a confirmed, excavated, genetically sampled archaeological presence. Every other group mentioned in the Egyptian texts, the Tijeker, the Weshesh, the Denyen, the Shekelesh, has left no confirmed skeletal material with recoverable ancient DNA. The Philistines are the only genetic window into the entire Sea Peoples episode. If the Philistines' ancestry breaks the Aegean model, the geographic origin story for the Sea Peoples as a whole becomes unstable. The second implication opens wider. If the ancestry signal points toward the central or western Mediterranean, the candidate populations shift dramatically. Nuragic Sardinia, Bronze Age Sicily, southern Italy, possibly Iberian groups. None of these were the headline candidates in the standard model. The Egyptian name Shurden has long been tentatively linked to Sardinia. That linkage was always speculative and linguistic. But now, there is at least a thread of possible biological consistency between Western Mediterranean populations and the people who appear in the Levant as Philistines. That thread is indirect. It is not proof. But it is a thread that did not exist before 2019. And the third implication challenges something even larger than the Philistines or the Sea Peoples. It challenges the model of the Bronze Age collapse itself. The standard collapse narrative treats the Sea Peoples as primarily an Aegean refugee phenomenon, displaced Mycenaeans and their neighbors, pushed out of a collapsing world, moving toward the still-standing civilizations of Egypt and the Levant. If the Sea Peoples included significant populations from the Western Mediterranean, then the collapse was not merely an Aegean event radiating outward. It was something more distributed, a cascade across a wider network than the textbook version of the Late Bronze Age usually describes. Were the Sea Peoples migrants, raiders, climate refugees, a loose coalition of unrelated displaced groups who happened to reach Egypt at roughly the same time and were recorded together in the Egyptian texts because Egypt encountered them together? The DNA cannot answer any of those questions, but it can say with reasonable confidence that the people buried at Ashkelon were not who the pottery comparisons, the name similarities, and 2 centuries of historical analysis had assumed. It's important to be honest about the limits here, because the limits are real and they matter. 4 individuals. That is the early Philistine sample at Ashkelon. 4 people. That is not a population. It is not a census. It is not a representative genetic survey of the Philistines or the Sea Peoples. The signal is statistically meaningful given what it is, but the confidence interval on any specific origin assignment is wide. The study's own authors are explicit about this. They do not claim to have identified the exact source population. They report a European-related ancestry component that does not match the Aegean as expected, and they acknowledge that a larger sample, denser reference populations from the Bronze Age Western Mediterranean, and additional excavated sites would be needed to sharpen the picture. Some researchers still argue that the Aegean component is present, but diluted into a broader European signal that includes Western Mediterranean ancestry, that the two are not mutually exclusive. The 2019 Ashkelon paper is foundational, but it is not the last word. What the study cannot tell us is almost as important as what it can. It cannot tell us which specific Western Mediterranean population contributed the ancestry. It cannot tell us whether the Philistines as a whole were genetically uniform, or whether different cities, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, had different founding populations. It cannot tell us whether the other Sea Peoples groups shared this Western Mediterranean signature, or whether they had different origins entirely. What it has done is made the old story untellable in its simple form, and opened a set of questions that will take years of additional excavation and sequencing to answer. Bronze Age Europe and the Mediterranean were more mobile than the traditional model assumed. Ancient DNA work across the continent has repeatedly found evidence of long-distance population movement in periods that were once imagined as relatively static. The Bronze Age Western Mediterranean, Sardinia, Sicily, the Italian peninsula, Iberia, is now understood to have been connected to a broader network of maritime interaction. The idea that populations from those regions could have contributed to a major migration event at the end of the Bronze Age is no longer implausible. It fits the emerging picture. The Sea and Sea Peoples may have been exactly that, a real maritime corridor used by people from multiple points of origin, arriving in the Eastern Mediterranean from directions that the Egyptian scribes recorded collectively because that is how they encountered them, as a wave from the sea. Go back to the wall at Medinet Habu. Look at those carved figures again. Feathered helmets, ox carts, women holding children, men in formation, a people moving not like raiders but like refugees, carrying everything, pushing toward the last standing civilizations of their world. Ramesses III defeated them, or at least he said he did, which is not quite the same thing, given that thousands of them ended up settling in Canaan regardless. They built cities. They buried their dead in their own way, with their own grave goods, practicing customs that stood apart from the people already living there. For 2 or 3 generations, the genetic difference between those buried in the early Philistine layer and the Canaanites around them was measurable, real, written into the double helix of actual human beings who lived, ate, died, and were put in the ground at Ashkelon 3,000 years ago. And then their children's children married into the local population, adopted local customs, shifted in the direction of the surrounding culture, and the biological distinctiveness faded. The European ancestry that had appeared so clearly in the founding generation became a diminishing signal, generation by generation, until it was gone. A people who shook the Bronze Age world, who appear in stone on the walls of Egypt's greatest temples, who gave their name, by way of the Romans, to an entire region that still carries it today, vanished from the genetic record within a few centuries of arriving. We have their bones. We have the DNA fragments extracted from those bones at extraordinary technical cost. We have a statistically significant signal that says they were not who the old theory assumed, and we still do not know, with the precision the question deserves, exactly where they came from. Somewhere in the Western Mediterranean, there may be a site not yet excavated, a burial ground not yet sampled, a population cluster not yet characterized in the ancient DNA record that would tell us what the Ashkelon signal is pointing toward. That site may already be known to archaeologists, The remains may be sitting in a storage facility somewhere, unsequenced. The reference population that would sharpen the answer may be a single study away, or the evidence may be gone, erased by the same climate that nearly destroyed the Ashkelon samples, by the same 3,000 years that reduced the written record of the Sea Peoples to a handful of Egyptian inscriptions and a carved wall. The past is not waiting to confirm what we already believe. Sometimes it refuses.